There is a woman at the western wall as the sun comes up over Jerusalem. She arrived before dawn, both hands flat against the ancient stone, forehead touching it, whispering something the people around her cannot hear. Around her, other women do the same, some rocking gently in the rhythm of Jewish prayer, some weeping quietly, some simply standing in silence with their eyes closed, pressing themselves against 2,000 years of mourning, a 10-minute walk away, on the platform above and behind her. The Fajr prayer has just ended at Al-Aqsa Mosque. The worshippers move through the gates of the noble sanctuary into the narrow streets below, which at this hour belong mostly to the light. A few minutes further, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a Greek Orthodox priest prepares the morning liturgy in a space Christians have been using for the same purpose since the 4th century. 3 prayers, 3 traditions, 1 city, 1 hill, within a walk of 15 minutes, in a space smaller than many shopping malls. You can be present at 3 acts of religious devotion that together represent the sacred center of life for roughly half the human beings alive on earth, among the most sacred places for any of them. All of it within a short walk. That is what Jerusalem is. Few cities have been fought over with more persistence, or at greater cost, or by more peoples across more centuries. Historians who have tried to count the times it changed hands have arrived at figures somewhere above 40, though the exact number depends on how you define conquest. It has been destroyed and rebuilt from rubble at least twice, besieged by armies whose names read like a survey of ancient civilization. And in the 20th century, the conflict over who it belongs to became one of the most consequential, unresolved disputes on the planet. What makes a city worth that much? That question is what this story tries to answer honestly. It begins not with a prophet or a king or a holy text. It begins before temples, before empires, before the city had a name history would remember. It begins with water. Chapter 1. The Spring and the Ridge. Stand on the ridge where Jerusalem sits and look at the landscape around you with the eyes of someone trying to survive rather than someone on vacation. The rock beneath your feet is pale limestone, hard and cracked open by summer heat. The soil is thin. There is no river, no harbor. The land does not flatten into anything you could call productive farmland. To the east, the ground drops sharply toward the Jordan Valley, a descent of nearly 4,000 feet in 15 miles. To the west, the hills roll toward the Mediterranean. In every direction, the terrain is the kind that experienced settlers look at and then look for somewhere easier. And yet people have been living on this ridge without interruption for 6,000 years. Something kept them here. That something was underground. The Gihon Spring emerges from the base of the eastern slope of the ridge. In a cave where water wells up from a fissure in the limestone, in a landscape this dry, a reliable source of fresh water is not a convenience. It is the difference between a permanent settlement and a temporary camp, between building something that lasts and moving on. The people who found the Gihon Spring understood this immediately. They built above it. They cut channels to direct it. They organized their community around the fact of it the way every early settlement in history organized itself around its most essential resource. Archaeologists working this site over many decades have found evidence of continuous human habitation going back to at least the 4th millennium before the Common Era. That is roughly 6,000 years ago. Pottery fragments, stone tools, traces of structures cut into the rock, all pointing to a community that established itself here and stayed. By the time we reach the Amarna letters, that remarkable archive of diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt in the 19th century of the Common Era, a city called Jerusalem appears by name in documents dated to roughly the 14th century before the Common Era. Around 3,400 years ago, these are among the earliest written records of Jerusalem's existence outside the Hebrew Bible. What is striking about those letters is not the city's power. They say almost nothing about that. What is striking is the tone. This small, resource-poor highland settlement corresponded with the most powerful monarch in the ancient world, as though such a request were a normal thing to make. Even then, Jerusalem thought of itself as significant. That quality, the sense of its own importance carried through every period of its history, regardless of actual size or military strength, is one of the things that makes Jerusalem unlike almost any other city in the ancient world. By around the 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era, the settlement on the ridge was known as Jebus, inhabited by a people called the Jebusites. They had been here long enough to build walls, to develop the water system into something sophisticated, and to feel entirely secure. The combination of steep valleys on 3 sides, the Kidron to the east and the Hinnom to the south and west, and strong stone walls gave them good reason. They had a specific feature they were proud of. Cut through the rock below the city, a shaft connected the Gihon spring to the settlement above, allowing the inhabitants to draw water from inside the walls during a siege. The thing that had made the city possible also made it defensible. That confidence would turn out to be precisely the wrong lesson to draw. A figure named David was about to arrive, and the shaft built to keep the city safe would become the path through which everything changed. David had spent years in the wilderness before he became king. He had served in the court of Saul, the first king of the Israelite confederation, then lived as a fugitive when Saul turned against him, moving through the Judean desert with a group of followers, surviving by military skill and what the biblical account describes as genuine religious conviction. When Saul died in battle, David was made king of his own tribe of Judah first. The northern tribes backed a surviving son of Saul. It took roughly 7 years before they accepted David as their king as well. And then he had a unified kingdom and a problem. The problem was the fragility of the unity itself. The northern and southern tribes had different histories, different loyalties, accumulated grievances across generations. What he needed was a capital that belonged to neither side, a place whose symbolic associations were not already claimed by any of the factions he was trying to bind together. Jebus sat on the border between the northern and southern territories. It was not Israelite. It belonged to the Jebusites. No tribe owned its history. It was exactly what David needed. The Jebusites, confident in their walls, reportedly taunted him when he arrived. The blind and the lame could hold these walls against you. It is among the oldest documented examples of military overconfidence in recorded history. What happened next is one of those moments where the text is suggestive and the archaeology is genuinely interesting. The account in the second book of Samuel mentions a tzinner, a Hebrew word scholars have debated for generations, translated variously as water shaft, conduit, or vertical passage, the most widely discussed interpretation, supported by the physical discovery of a rock-cut shaft connecting the Gihon spring to the city above, is that David's soldiers found their way into the city through the water system. The feature built to make the city survive a siege became the opening through which the siege was bypassed entirely. David took the city. He named it the City of David. And then he did the thing that transformed a political calculation into something that would echo for 3,000 years. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark, according to the Hebrew Bible, was the chest containing the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, the physical symbol of the covenant between God and the people of Israel. It had been carried through the wilderness. It had traveled with the tribes through their settlement in Canaan, and now David brought it into his new capital, reportedly dancing before it in the streets as it entered the city, in an act of public religious expression that the text describes as embarrassing to his wife and entirely characteristic of the man. A neutral city between north and south now housed the most sacred object in the Israelite tradition. This place belonged to all of them because it now held something larger than any tribe. David gathered materials for a temple to house the ark permanently. His son would build it. The idea of what Jerusalem could become was already larger than what it currently was. That gap between what Jerusalem was and what people believed it could be would define the next 3,000 years of its existence. Chapter 2. David, Solomon, and the First Temple. His name was Yosef, and he was a stone carver from the hill country of Judah. He had been working in Jerusalem for 3 years when the temple was finally dedicated. He was not important enough to be named in any record that survived. He was one of thousands like him. People who had cut limestone and hauled cedar and fitted joints in the long mountain of work that Solomon's project required. He had a wife and 2 children waiting in a village 2 days' walk to the south. He sent a portion of his wages back to them through a merchant traveling that direction whenever he could. On the day of the dedication, he stood with the other workers in one of the outer courts and watched the priests carry the ark into the Holy of Holies. He could not see the ark from where he stood, but he could see the faces of the priests when they came back out. What he knew was this: he had built something. His hands had shaped the stone beneath the feet of people entering the presence of God. Whatever happened to him after, whatever the village and the children and the ordinary weight of his life produced, he had done this. He is in no historical record, but he was there, he and the thousands like him, whose labor made the temple real, whose names history never bothered to keep. Solomon came to power sometime around 960 years before the Common Era. By the most widely accepted scholarly estimates, he inherited a kingdom his father had built through decades of warfare and political calculation, and he used it in a way his father had been denied. He built the temple Solomon raised on the hill called Moriah, to the north of the original city of David, was by ancient Near Eastern standards a significant and carefully constructed religious building. The Hebrew Bible describes it in considerable detail: a rectangular structure with a vestibule, a main hall, and an innermost room, the Holy of Holies, where the ark would rest, cedar wood from Lebanon, transported at the kind of expense only a wealthy state could absorb. Skilled craftsmen from the Phoenician city of Tyre brought their expertise in working metal and carved stone. The construction took, according to the biblical account, 7 years. When it was dedicated, the account in the first book of Kings describes the ark being carried into the Holy of Holies, the priests withdrawing, and a cloud filling the temple so that they could not minister because something they had no word for had arrived. This was not simply a grand building. This was the point on earth where the distance between the human and the divine was smallest, the place where prayer was most directly heard, where heaven and earth came closest to touching. That idea that this specific hilltop in this specific city is the place where God is most present, is the idea that has made Jerusalem what it is for 3,000 years. Every tradition that subsequently connected itself to this place either inherited that idea, transformed it, or argued with it. None of them ignored it. Archaeologists have not found physical remains of Solomon's temple. The site where it stood has been in continuous religious use for 3,000 years, with later structures built on top of earlier ones, making excavation either impossible, for those who regard the site as sacred, unthinkable. What archaeology has found in the Jerusalem area broadly suggests construction activity consistent with a significant building program in the 10th century before the Common Era. Though scholars continue to debate how to read that evidence against the biblical texts, what is not in question is the effect. A city that contains the most sacred object of a people, housed in a structure built specifically for that purpose, staffed by a priesthood whose entire identity is organized around the rituals connecting that people to their God, is not merely a political capital, it is the center of a universe. Solomon died. What ended his reign was not conquest. It was taxation. The building projects had been expensive, and the northern tribes bore a disproportionate share of the cost, while the temple and palace accumulated in the south. When his son Rehoboam rejected their appeal for relief, the northern tribes rejected him. The unified kingdom split. The north became Israel. The south became Judah, with Jerusalem and the temple. For 3 centuries, both kingdoms navigated a Near East, growing increasingly dangerous around them. Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 years before the Common Era, deporting its population in what gave rise to the idea of the 10 lost tribes. Judah survived longer through tribute and fortune. Under King Hezekiah, in the late 8th century before the Common Era, workers cut a tunnel through solid rock to bring water from the Gihon spring inside the city walls. That tunnel still exists. Visitors wade through it today. In the original channel, in the direction the water once flowed. It is among the oldest pieces of accessible ancient infrastructure anywhere in the world, in use in one form or another since the 8th century before the Common Era. But the threat from the east did not disappear. It transformed. Babylon rose to replace Assyria as the dominant power of the ancient Near East. Under a king named Nebuchadnezzar II, he came to Jerusalem twice before the final blow. In 597 years before the Common Era, he besieged the city, deported a significant portion of the population to Babylon, and installed a king of his choosing on Jerusalem's throne. That king eventually joined a rebellion. Given the military realities, it was not a wise decision. Nebuchadnezzar returned in 589 years before the Common Era and besieged the city for roughly 18 months. The Book of Lamentations describes those months from inside the walls. Famine, despair, the steady shrinking of what was possible, the knowledge that the force outside was larger than anything the city could match. In 586 years before the Common Era, the walls were breached, the palace was burned, the walls were torn down. The remaining population was marched east toward Babylon, and the temple, the building that Solomon had spent years constructing from the finest materials the ancient world could provide, was burned to the ground. The fire consumed a building, what it could not consume, and what no one at the time could have predicted it would fail to consume, was the idea the building represented. Men like Joseph had built something that outlasted every empire that would ever try to destroy it. Not the stones. The stones burned. The idea turned out to be indestructible. That idea was about to travel to Babylon, and what happened to it there would change Jerusalem more permanently than the fire ever could. Chapter 3: Babylonian Exile and the Invention of Longing. Picture them walking east, not in chain. For the most part, Babylonian deportation policy was not primarily about punishment. It was about transplanting useful people, skilled people, educated people. It was craftsmen and scribes and priests and soldiers whose abilities could serve the empire in its capital rather than sustain resistance in a troublesome province. They walked toward a city most of them had never seen, away from the hills they had known all their lives. Babylonian administrative records from this period mention Judean exiles by name in lists of rations distributed and labor organized. These are not famous figures from the biblical narrative. They are ordinary people, families and individuals recorded in the bureaucratic shorthand of an empire keeping track of its transplanted population. The exiles were real. They are documented outside their own tradition. They were treated reasonably well by the standards of ancient deportation. They could own property. They could engage in trade. Some prospered. Some adopted Babylonian names alongside their Judean ones. The accommodation that people make when they are living inside a culture that surrounds them on all sides. But something else was happening that the Babylonian administrative records did not capture and had no reason to track. The exiles were thinking about Jerusalem, not just remembering it, not just mourning it, something more active and more consequential. They were working out who they were without it. And in working out who they were without it, they were discovering that what Jerusalem meant to them was larger than Jerusalem itself. Think about what the destruction of the temple meant for people whose entire religious practice was organized around it. The temple was not simply a building where you went to pray. It was the place where the sacrifices maintaining the relationship between God and Israel were performed. The priesthood, whose entire identity was organized around those sacrifices, was now in Babylon, far from the altar where their function had any meaning. The religious calendar, organizing the year around festivals tied to specific sacred places, was being observed in exile, in a landscape that was not the landscape those festivals had been made for. How do you maintain a religious tradition when the physical center of that tradition is gone? The answer the exiles worked out is one of the most significant developments in human history. And it happened not despite the loss of Jerusalem, but because of it. If the temple could be destroyed and the exile could happen, then the relationship between God and Israel could not be simply a matter of performing the right rituals in the right place. It had to be something more portable, more internal, more textual. The exile period is the period when scholars believe many of the core texts of what would become the Hebrew Bible were collected, edited, and shaped into something closer to their present form. The scribes and priests who had maintained the tradition in Jerusalem became the people who wrote it down, because writing it down was the only way to preserve it when the physical institutions that had carried it were gone. The Psalms contain some of the most moving expressions of this loss that survive from any culture in the ancient world. The 137th Psalm opens at the rivers of Babylon, where the exiles sat and wept when they remembered Zion. It describes harps hung on willows because singing the songs of their homeland in a foreign land felt impossible. It reaches its most intense moment when it declares Jerusalem to be above every joy, not as a pleasant memory, not as a preference, but as the organizing principle of what joy means in the first place. That is a very different kind of attachment than most people have to most places, and it created a problem that has not been solved since. A people whose deepest identity is organized around a specific place they do not currently inhabit will, sooner or later, want to return. And if they return, and if someone else has been living there, the encounter between the returning people and the people already present will not be simple, because the claim being made is not a practical claim about housing or governance. It is a claim about identity. And identity claims are not resolved by compromise the way disputes over grain prices or border lines can be resolved. The exiles did not know they were creating this problem. They were simply doing what people do when everything they have built is taken from them. They were insisting, with everything available to them, that it still existed, that it was still real. That insistence kept them alive as a people. It also built into the future of Jerusalem a tension that no subsequent ruler or diplomat has ever found a way to fully dissolve. Then, suddenly and unexpectedly, an emperor from the East made a decision that almost no conqueror before him had made. He let them go home. His name was Cyrus II, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. He defeated the Babylonians in 539 years before the Common Era with a speed that surprised everyone. And then he issued a decree permitting the displaced peoples of the former Babylonian Empire to return to their homelands and restore their temples. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay object recovered in the 19th century of the Common Era and now held in the British Museum in London, records this policy. It is sometimes described as the world's first declaration of religious tolerance, a characterization that many historians regard as significantly overstated. Since the document is as much imperial propaganda as principled statement, but it does reflect a governing philosophy genuinely unusual among ancient conquerors. Subject peoples who felt respected were more reliable than subject peoples who burned with resentment. For the Judean exiles in Babylon, the decree of 538 years before the Common Era was something that prayer had asked for and that most of them may have stopped fully believing would arrive. They could go back. Not all of them went. 2 generations had been born in Babylon. Some families had prospered enough that a long journey to a ruined city offered less than the life they had built, but enough returned to begin the work. The Second Temple, completed in 516 years before the Common Era, during the reign of the Persian king Darius I. was, by all accounts, a more modest structure than what had preceded it. The Book of Ezra records that older people who had seen the first temple wept at the dedication ceremony, whether from joy at the rebuilding or grief at the comparison, or both at the same time. The text does not fully resolve, but it was there. Jerusalem was a city again. The exile was over. What the exile had produced, however, was something no physical rebuilding could undo. Jerusalem had become two things simultaneously: a real place, with a spring and a temple and people going about their daily lives, and an idea, an identity anchor, a concept whose meaning had been tested by loss and found to be indestructible. Those two versions of Jerusalem would sometimes be the same thing and sometimes be in profound tension with each other. From the west, a young man from Macedonia was remaking the world. He was moving fast, and he was moving in this direction. Chapter 4. Persians, Greeks, and the Temple rebuilt. The Persian period in Jerusalem lasted roughly 2 centuries, and it was, by the standards of what the city had experienced and would experience, relatively quiet. The temple functioned, the priesthood maintained its rituals. The walls were rebuilt under Nehemiah in a construction project described in the book that bears his name as so urgent that the workers held a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other against the threat of attack. The community reorganized itself around the texts and the practices the exile had preserved. Then, in the spring of 333 years before the Common Era, the world changed at a speed that even the most alert observer could not have fully anticipated. Alexander III of Macedon had already crossed into Persia and won a decisive battle at Issus, opening the Levant to his advance. He was 23 years old. He had done things that military historians still analyze with something approaching disbelief. Not just his tactical brilliance, but his absolute refusal to leave any significant fortified position behind his lines. The Phoenician city of Tyre had required a 7-month siege and the construction of a causeway across the sea before he moved on. He would not be outpaced by an undefeated enemy at his back. Jerusalem was directly in his path. What happened when Alexander reached Jerusalem is one of those historical puzzles where the Jewish sources and the broader historical record diverge in ways that have never been fully reconciled. The main Jewish account, preserved in the writings of the historian Josephus from the 1st century of the Common Era, describes a meeting between Alexander and the high priest of Jerusalem in which Alexander dismounted from his horse and prostrated himself before the priest, explaining to his astonished generals that he had seen this figure in a dream before leaving Macedonia and understood it as a divine sign. Historians approach this account with appropriate skepticism. Josephus was writing more than 3 centuries after the events he describes. The story has the characteristics of a narrative shaped by later purposes rather than contemporary documentation. What the historical record does confirm is the outcome. Alexander did not destroy Jerusalem. He did not sack it. He left the temple standing and the community intact. This was not his universal policy. Tyre had been destroyed. Gaza had been treated harshly after resistance. Why Jerusalem was treated differently remains genuinely uncertain. The city may have submitted without resistance. The temple treasury may have been useful to Alexander in ways that made preservation more attractive than destruction. Whatever the reason, one of the most efficient destroyers of cities in the ancient world passed through and left the most sacred place in the Jewish world, intact. Alexander died in 323 years before the Common Era in Babylon. At the age of 32, leaving an empire with no clear succession plan. Jerusalem and the surrounding territory passed back and forth between two of his successor kingdoms. The Ptolemies based in Egypt and the Seleucids based in Syria. Under Ptolemaic rule in the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Jewish community was largely left to manage its own religious affairs as long as taxes were paid. Then the Seleucids gained control in 198 years before the Common Era, and the period of relative stability began to end. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV styled himself Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. He ruled from 175 to 164 years before the Common Era and held views about cultural uniformity that his subject peoples consistently found more compelling in theory than in practice. The Hellenization he promoted, the adoption of Greek language, custom, and religious form, was for its advocates a genuine modernization program. For the majority of Jerusalem's Jewish population, it was an existential threat to the identity that 2 generations of exile had taught them to protect at any cost. The crisis came in 167 years before the Common Era. Antiochus entered Jerusalem, plundered the temple treasury, and desecrated the temple itself. An altar to Zeus was erected in the temple courtyard. Jewish religious observance, including Sabbath practice and circumcision, was prohibited on pain of death. The first book of Maccabees, among the more historically grounded sources for this period, describes not rhetorical suppression but actual enforcement. Mothers executed with their children for circumcision. People killed for refusing to violate Jewish law. Sit with that for a moment. What Antiochus failed to understand is something that rulers attempting to suppress religious identity by force have failed to understand across the entire span of recorded history. Persecution does not extinguish the identity being persecuted. It intensifies it. It confirms, for the people experiencing it, the narrative their tradition has been telling them about themselves. The response came from a priestly family in a town northwest of Jerusalem. A man named Mattathias refused a direct order to perform a pagan sacrifice. He killed the Seleucid officer and the Jew who had stepped forward to comply in his place. He and his sons fled to the hills and began a guerrilla campaign. The son who emerged as its military leader was known as Judah Maccabee, and the movement he led is known as the Maccabean Revolt. By 164 years before the Common Era, 3 years after the desecration began, the temple had been retaken and rededicated. The rededication ceremony, on the 25th of the Hebrew month of Kislev, is the event that the festival of Hanukkah commemorates every year. A small, outgunned force fought for the right to practice their religion in their sacred city, and they won. The Hasmonean dynasty that emerged governed Judea for roughly a century. It was not a golden age. Intermittent civil war, competing factions, the kind of dynastic maneuvering that large amounts of power tend to produce. But it was a century of political independence, the last such century for the better part of 2,000 years. Into the complicated world of this independent Judea, from the west, the Romans arrived. The Roman general Pompey reached Jerusalem in 63 years before the Common Era after being invited into a Hasmonean succession dispute by one of the competing claimants. It was the kind of invitation that Rome was very good at accepting, and that the people who extended it consistently came to regret. Pompey besieged the Temple Mount for 3 months before breaking through. He entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber where only the high priest was permitted to go. Once each year, he found nothing inside. No idol, no image, an empty room. His reaction, as reported by Josephus, was genuine bewilderment. A god with no physical form, a holiest place that contained nothing visible. This was, to a Roman military commander, a category of religious experience he had no framework for. Pompey left the temple intact. He had looked into the center of Jewish religious life and found something he did not know what to do with. Rome had arrived in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem had survived the arrival. But Roman arrival was never Roman departure. Chapter 5. Home, Herod and the Temple of Marble. Herod the Great is the most difficult figure in Jerusalem's entire history. Not because the sources are unclear, though they sometimes are. Not because his achievements are modest, because they were extraordinary, but because the same man who murdered members of his own family, who, according to the Gospel of Matthew, ordered the killing of infant boys in Bethlehem in a desperate attempt to eliminate a potential rival to his throne, who ruled through surveillance and violence that his subjects never forgave, is also the man who gave Jerusalem the most magnificent building it had ever contained, a temple so extraordinary that ancient sources describe it as among the greatest structures in the world. That combination sits in the historical record and refuses to be resolved into something simpler. Herod came from a family of Idumeans, a people south of Judea who had been forcibly converted to Judaism during the Hasmonean period. His credentials as a Jew were always contested. His father had made himself useful to the Hasmonean rulers and then to Rome as Roman involvement in the region deepened. Herod inherited his father's political instincts and his connections, and he would need both. The Roman Republic was in the process of destroying itself through civil war. Julius Caesar, Pompey, Mark Antony, Octavian, the defining figures of Rome's final republican generation, competed for dominance in conflicts that sent shockwaves through every Roman territory. Herod's genius was the ability to read which direction power was shifting and position himself accordingly, switching allegiances at the right moments without making permanent enemies of those he was temporarily abandoning. He backed Mark Antony in the critical years. When Antony was defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 years before the Common Era and Octavian became the unquestioned master of the Roman world, Herod went to meet him. He reportedly placed his crown on the ground before Octavian and said that he had been loyal to Antony and would be equally loyal to Octavian if Octavian would have him. Octavian, who would become the Emperor Augustus, had him. A man who could speak that plainly about political reality was exactly the kind of local ruler Rome found useful. The Romans confirmed Herod as king of Judea in 37 years before the Common Era, and he would reign until 4 years before the Common Era. Roughly 33 years. The scale of what he built in that time is genuinely difficult to convey. He rebuilt and massively expanded the temple complex, enclosing the top of the ridge in a retaining wall structure and filling in the area inside it to create an enormous, flat plaza. The dimensions were extraordinary. Roughly 500 meters from north to south and 300 meters from east to west, covering approximately 35 acres, requiring the movement of a quantity of stone and earth that ancient sources describe as one of the great engineering projects of the era. The Temple Mount that visitors walk today, the platform containing both the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is essentially the platform that Herod's engineers created. Its dimensions are Herod's dimensions. The Western Wall, today the holiest site in Judaism at which prayer is permitted, is not the wall of the temple itself. It is one face of the retaining wall Herod built to support the temple platform. The temple stood above and behind it. The wall that millions of people have touched and prayed at for 2,000 years is the outer face of a civil engineering project, made sacred not by what it was, but by what it survived. The temple that sat on this platform was covered in white marble and gold. The historian Josephus, who had actually seen it before its destruction and wrote within a generation of that event, described how the sunlight reflected off the gold and marble so intensely that visitors approaching from a distance could barely look at it directly. He described it resembling from afar a mountain covered in snow. These are the words of a witness. It did not make his subjects love him. The taxation required to fund the building projects pressed hard on a population that had not asked for them. The king claiming to rebuild God's temple was also building theaters for Roman-style entertainment in its shadow. His personal life was a study in the paranoia that absolute power tends to generate. He executed his wife, Mariamne, a Hasmonean princess whose royal blood gave her a legitimacy claim he could never entirely neutralize. He executed 2 of his sons by Mariamne on charges of conspiracy. He executed a 3rd son from a different marriage in the final days before his own death. The Emperor Augustus reportedly said, playing on the fact that as a nominal Jew, Herod did not eat pork, that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Herod died in 4 years before the Common Era. His kingdom was divided among his surviving sons by Augustus. None of them had their father's abilities. Roman administration in Judea grew increasingly heavy-handed through the following decades, appointing and removing high priests as political convenience required, storing the sacred vestments in a Roman fortress and releasing them only for the major festivals. The Jewish population experienced this as a daily reminder of who was actually in control of their most sacred institution. The pressure was building. The theological energy of a people reading prophetic texts about liberation while living under occupation. The economic strain of a heavily taxed population. The various factions within Jewish society pulling in different directions about what to do and how to respond. It was all moving towards something. In the late 20s of the Common Era, a man from the Galilee region arrived in Jerusalem and caused a disturbance in the temple courts that would set in motion events whose consequences neither he nor anyone else in that city could have foreseen. The temple was still standing. The prayers were still rising from the platform Herod had built. None of that would be true much longer. Chapter 6. Jesus, Rome and Aelia, Capitolina. Any honest account of this period has to acknowledge something specific before it begins. The events of the 1st century of the Common Era in Jerusalem are the most written about, the most analyzed, and the most contested in the entire history of the city. Billions of people have organized their lives around their understanding of what happened here in roughly a 30-year window. The traditions that grew from those events produced the New Testament, the theological councils of the early church, and eventually the dominant religious culture of the Western world for 2,000 years. Separating what can be established through the kinds of evidence historians use from what is held by faith, without dismissing the faith or misrepresenting the evidence, requires care. 3 categories of information exist for this period: what the sources agree on, what the sources dispute, and what cannot be verified by historical method but matters historically because so many people have believed it and organized their lives around it. All 3 categories are real. Conflating them is where honest history goes wrong. His name in Hebrew was Yeshua, rendered in Greek as Jesus, in Latin as Iesus, from which the English name Jesus derives. The historical existence of Jesus is not seriously disputed by mainstream scholarship. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 117 of the Common Era, refers to a Christus who was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The Jewish historian Josephus includes references to Jesus in his work. Though scholars debate how much of the surviving text reflects Josephus's original words and how much was modified by later Christian copyists who preserved the manuscripts, the theological claims made about Jesus are outside the scope of historical method. The person is not. The city that Jesus entered during the late 20s of the Common Era was under pressure from multiple directions. The Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, who held the post from 26 to 36 of the Common Era, is described in both Roman and Jewish sources as a harsh administrator with limited sensitivity to Jewish religious practice, a characterization the documented episodes of his governance tend to support. The temple establishment was simultaneously trying to maintain Jewish religious life and manage its relationship with Rome in ways that satisfied neither God nor Caesar. The population was taxed heavily and fed a steady diet of prophetic expectation. What the Gospels describe, written in the decades after the events they record and drawing on earlier sources, is a ministry centered first in Galilee and ending in Jerusalem. The entry into the city during the Passover festival is described in all 4 Gospels. The confrontation in the temple, in which Jesus reportedly overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those selling animals for sacrifice, appears across the Gospel accounts with enough consistency to suggest a genuine historical memory of some kind of dramatic public action in the temple precinct. The structure of what followed is historically legible. Jesus came to Jerusalem at Passover, the festival commemorating liberation from slavery, and took actions that brought him to the attention of both the temple authorities and the Roman administration. The trial that followed involved both a Jewish hearing and a Roman hearing before Pilate, reflecting the legal reality of the period in which capital sentences required Roman authorization. The crucifixion of Jesus, probably around 30 of the Common Era, is among the best attested facts of his life in the non-Christian historical record. Crucifixion was the Roman method of execution for non-citizens convicted of crimes against the state. The location, outside the city walls, corresponds to what we know of Roman practice. What happened in the days after the crucifixion is the foundational claim of Christianity and the point at which historical method reaches its limit. The resurrection is not the kind of event that can be established or refuted through the tools historians use to assess evidence. What historical method can say is this: within a very short time after the crucifixion, a community in Jerusalem was claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that claim spread with a speed that surprised everyone, including, in all likelihood, the people making it. The early Christian community in Jerusalem was not, in its first generation, a religion separate from Judaism. It was a Jewish movement that believed the Messiah had come. Its members continued to attend the temple. They continued to observe Jewish law. For roughly 3 decades, this community existed as one Jewish sect among several in a city full of competing interpretations of what God was doing in the world. That world was moving toward catastrophe at a pace none of the competing interpretations fully anticipated. By the mid-1st century of the Common Era, the tensions between Judea's Jewish population and Roman administration had reached a point where accommodation was becoming genuinely difficult. A series of brutal governors had inflamed the population. Various groups were moving toward active resistance. In 66 of the Common Era, open revolt broke out. The initial Jewish military successes were significant enough to encourage belief that victory was possible. That belief made the eventual outcome worse. The Roman general Vespasian began a systematic campaign of reconquest, starting in Galilee and moving south, reducing each town before advancing to the next. By 69, called back to Rome to become emperor, he handed command of the Jerusalem siege to his son Titus. Jerusalem at this point held not only its regular population, but enormous numbers of refugees from the surrounding areas, swollen further by Passover pilgrims trapped inside as the Roman forces closed in. The factions within the city spent part of the siege fighting each other as well as the Romans outside the walls, destroying food supplies in internecine conflict that the historian Josephus, who had defected to the Roman side and was watching from their lines, describes with a mixture of horror and bitterness that carries through his writing even in translation. The siege lasted approximately 5 months. The temple fell and burned in the late summer of 70 of the Common Era. Whether Titus intended to destroy it or whether the fire was set by soldiers acting without orders is a question that ancient sources answer differently and that historians continue to debate. What is not debated is what the archaeological record has confirmed. At the base of the southern wall of the Temple Mount, massive stones tumbled from the platform onto the street below, where some of them remain today in the archaeological park, left exactly where they fell, as a deliberate act of preservation and witness. The Arch of Titus in Rome, built to commemorate his victory, shows Roman soldiers carrying the temple menorah through the streets of Rome in triumph. People still stop in front of it today and understand exactly what they are looking at. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era ended the sacrificial system that had been the center of Jewish religious life for 1,000 years. But the exile had already taught the Jewish people what to do when the temple was gone. The synagogue, the rabbi, the study of texts. The liturgical prayers developed as substitutes for sacrifice. All of it was ready. Not because anyone had planned specifically for this catastrophe, but because the previous catastrophe had produced the tools for surviving this one. One further catastrophe for Jerusalem in its ancient form remained. In 132 of the Common Era, a major Jewish revolt broke out under a leader known as Simon Bar Kokhba. It lasted 3 years and required the Emperor Hadrian to commit substantial military resources to suppress it. The casualties on both sides were enormous. When Hadrian suppressed the revolt, he decided to solve the Jerusalem problem permanently. He razed what remained of the Jewish city. On its ruins, he built a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, giving it his own family name and that of the Capitoline gods. A temple to Jupiter was built on or near the site of the destroyed Jewish temple. Jews were formally forbidden from entering the city on pain of death, except on 1 day per year when they could enter and mourn at the ruins. The name Jerusalem was suppressed in official usage. Hadrian had done everything a Roman emperor could do to make Jerusalem cease to exist. The result was entirely predictable to anyone paying attention to the previous 8 centuries of this city's history. The very completeness of the attempt made Jerusalem more significant, not less. The mourning organized around the 1 permitted day of entry per year kept the connection alive in exactly the way mourning had kept it alive in Babylon. The texts describing the temple were studied and transmitted specifically because the temple was gone. The prayers directed toward Jerusalem multiplied precisely because Jerusalem was inaccessible. And among the new residents of Aelia Capitolina, something else was happening. The community of Jesus' followers had continued to grow. Their message was spreading through the Roman world along trade routes and military roads. The building Hadrian constructed over the site Christians identified as the place of the crucifixion and burial, intended to suppress its significance, would eventually become the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Hadrian built over the Christian holy sites and preserved the memory of their locations across 2 centuries until the political climate changed. The political climate would change from an army on a riverbank in northern Britain, where a young officer named Constantine was about to be proclaimed emperor by his troops. Chapter 7. Constantine, Helena, and the Christian city. Her name was Miriam, and she sold oil lamps near the steps of the Nea Ecclesia on the southern ridge of Jerusalem. She had been selling lamps in the same spot for 19 years. The lamps she sold were practical things: fired clay with a wick hole. Nothing fine. But the pilgrims who came to the Nea needed light for their evening prayers and for the shrines they visited in the darker hours. And Miriam understood this market the way only someone who had watched it for 19 years could understand it. She was not Christian. She was Jewish, one of the small Jewish community that had been slowly permitted back into parts of the city since the days of Constantine. She lit no candles to Jesus or to Mary, but she had made her living from the pilgrimage economy for 2 decades, and she was practical enough to understand that the faith filling this city with visitors from across the world was the reason she could afford to eat. On the afternoon of June 26th, in 614 of the Common Era, she heard the news from a traveler coming south from the Damascus Gate. The Persians had broken through the Byzantine defenses north of the city. They were coming. By nightfall she had packed everything that could be carried and given away everything that could not. She did not know if she would ever come back. She was not one specific person. She stands for the hundreds of thousands of ordinary inhabitants of Jerusalem across the Byzantine centuries, whose names survive in no record, but whose daily movements shaped the city as much as any emperor's decree. 3 centuries before Miriam packed her lamps and fled, a decision had been made that transformed the city she lived in. In 312 of the Common Era, on the evening before the Battle of Milvian Bridge outside Rome. The Emperor Constantine reportedly received a vision. The accounts of what he saw differ in their details. The historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who knew Constantine personally and wrote his biography, describes a cross of light in the sky above the sun, with words saying by this, "Cunquer." The writer Lactantius describes a dream in which Constantine was instructed to mark his soldiers' shields with a Christian symbol. The two accounts are not identical, and historians read both with attention to the fact that they were written by Christian admirers who had reason to present the emperor's conversion in the most dramatic possible terms. What is not disputed is the outcome. Constantine won the battle. He attributed the victory to the Christian God, and in 313 of the Common Era, he issued the Edict of Milan jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, granting religious tolerance throughout the Roman Empire and ending the systematic persecution of Christians. The consequences for Jerusalem were immediate, dramatic, and permanent. A city that had been Aelia Capitolina, a medium-sized Roman colony with no particular distinction, suddenly became one of the most important locations in the Christian world. The sites associated with the life and death of Jesus, which Christian pilgrims had been visiting quietly and persistently even during the period of official suppression, were now the object of imperial attention. And imperial attention in the Roman world meant imperial resources. Constantine's mother, Helena, was, by 326 of the Common Era, a woman in her late 70s or early 80s, by ancient standards, an extreme old age. She was the mother of an emperor and had been given the title Augusta. She made a journey to the Holy Land with access to both personal authority and imperial funds, and undertook in effect a program of identifying and marking the sacred geography of Christian tradition. What the tradition that grew up around Helena's journey says she found is the true cross, the actual wooden cross of the crucifixion, discovered buried beneath or near the site where Hadrian had built his temple to Venus. The accounts of this discovery were written down in their most elaborate form decades after Helena's visit, and the tradition grew considerably in the telling over subsequent centuries. What we can say with confidence is that Helena visited Jerusalem, that she was involved in identifying and marking sites associated with Jesus, and that she commissioned the construction of major churches on at least 2 sites. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, begun around 326 and dedicated in 335, enclosed within a single complex, the site traditionally identified as the place of the crucifixion, the tomb, and the place of the resurrection. The structure that Constantine's architects built was large and impressive by the standards of its time. The site has been continuously identified, continuously venerated, and continuously built over since the early 4th century. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre that visitors enter today, with its layered architecture reflecting the work of different centuries and different Christian communities, its competing chapels maintained by different churches under arrangements going back to the medieval period, is in a direct line from the building Constantine raised on this ground. The transformation attracted pilgrims. They arrived from across the Christian world, drawn by the opportunity to walk where Jesus had walked, to pray where he had prayed, to stand on the ground where the events their faith was built on had taken place. Jerusalem grew. New churches went up. under the Emperor Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 of the Common Era. Jerusalem received one of its most magnificent Christian buildings, the Nea Ecclesia. The new Church of the Theotokos was a massive basilica dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Its foundations rediscovered in archaeological excavations in the 20th century of the Common Era, confirming that it was indeed very large. It was funded directly by Justinian's imperial treasury. Jerusalem, at the height of the Byzantine period, was the wealthiest, most extensively built, most pilgrimage-visited version of itself that had yet existed. This was the city where Miriam sold her oil lamps. Then, in June of 614 of the Common Era, the Sassanid Persian Empire under Khosrow II arrived. The Persian army swept through Syria and descended on Jerusalem with a speed the Byzantine garrison could not match. Contemporary accounts, whose numbers historians treat with caution given the difficulty of verifying figures from this period, describe heavy casualties during the capture. The churches burned. The Christian population was killed, enslaved, or driven out in large numbers, and the relic that had become the most sacred physical object in the Christian world was taken. The true cross, housed in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre since Helena's time, was carried away to Persia. For the Byzantine Christian world, the loss was not simply a military defeat. It was a theological crisis. The object representing the physical instrument of salvation was in the hands of Zoroastrian pagans in a foreign empire. The theological effort to understand what that meant produced an outpouring of writing that gives us a clear picture of how devastating this moment felt from the inside. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius eventually defeated the Persians in a campaign that historians regard as one of the great military reversals of the ancient world. In 628 of the Common Era, he recovered the true cross and restored it to Jerusalem in a ceremony that contemporary sources describe with extraordinary emotional intensity. He reportedly carried the relic into the city on his own shoulders, an act of deliberate humility, drawing on the imagery of Christ carrying the cross. The recovery lasted less than a decade. While Heraclius had been fighting Persia in the east, something had been happening in the Arabian Peninsula that neither the Byzantine nor the Persian Empire had registered adequately. A religious movement of extraordinary cohesion and military energy had emerged from the desert, united under a revelation that its followers believed to be the final and complete word of the same God worshipped by Jews and Christians. And it was moving north with a speed that neither exhausted empire was in a position to contain. Jerusalem was about to change hands again, and the people coming toward it believed, with total conviction, that this city was not just a military objective, it was theirs. Chapter 8. Omar, the Dome and the Arab City. In the year 610 of the Common Era, a merchant from Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula began receiving what he described as revelations from God, transmitted through the angel Gabriel. His name was Muhammad ibn Abdullah. The revelations he received over the next 23 years became the Quran, the foundational scripture of a new religion that called itself Islam, meaning submission to God. The religion Muhammad proclaimed was not, in its own self-understanding, a new religion at all. It was the final and complete form of the same revelation given previously. in incomplete form, to the prophets before him, including Abraham, including Moses, including Jesus. The God of Islam was the same God as the God of Judaism and the God of Christianity. Jesus was recognized as a prophet of the highest rank, born of a virgin and performing miracles. Though the Islamic understanding explicitly rejected the Christian claim that Jesus was divine or that he died on the cross, this theological connection to the earlier Abrahamic traditions meant that Jerusalem was significant to Islam from the very beginning, before a single Muslim soldier had come near the city. The connection had a specific and particular form that distinguished it from abstract theological inheritance. One of the most sacred narratives in Islam describes what is called the night journey, the Isra and Miraj. According to this tradition, the Prophet Muhammad was transported miraculously in a single night from Mecca to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem ascended through the heavens to the presence of God, before returning to Mecca by morning. The departure point in Jerusalem, according to Islamic tradition, was the rock on the summit of the Temple Mount. This narrative exists within the Islamic tradition and is not attested in sources independent of that tradition. It is presented here as what it is: a foundational religious belief of profound importance to nearly 2 billion people, which is itself a historical fact of enormous consequence, regardless of how one reads the underlying claim. The same rock that Jewish tradition associated with Abraham's near sacrifice of his son and with the site of the Holy of Holies would eventually be covered by one of the most beautiful buildings in the history of human architecture. Muhammad died in 632 of the Common Era. The community he had built erupted outward with an energy that neither the Byzantine Empire to the north nor the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east was able to contain. The two great empires had exhausted each other in decades of warfare. The Arab armies that came out of the desert moved against opponents who were, in varying degrees, depleted and demoralized. The decisive battle came at the Yarmouk River in 636 of the Common Era, where Arab forces defeated the Byzantine army so completely that organized Byzantine resistance in Syria effectively ended. Jerusalem, which had a garrison but no credible relief force, entered negotiations. The man who came to accept the surrender was the second caliph of Islam, Omar ibn al-Khattab, known in English as Omar. He was the successor to the Prophet's first successor, and he was overseeing the most rapid territorial expansion in the history of religion up to that point. What happened when Omar arrived at Jerusalem is described in several early Islamic sources. The accounts vary in their details in ways that make precise reconstruction difficult. What they consistently describe is this: Omar entered the city not in the manner of a conqueror arriving to humiliate a defeated enemy, but in a manner that multiple sources characterize as deliberately humble. He was met by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, who had held out specifically for the Caliph to come in person rather than surrendering to a subordinate commander. Omar was taken, by several accounts, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Patriarch invited him to pray inside. Omar declined. His reason, as the tradition records it, was explicit. If he prayed inside the church, Muslims in future generations might take his action as a precedent and claim the site as a mosque. By praying outside, he preserved the church as a Christian place of worship, Historians approach these accounts with the care that all ancient sources require. They were written down after the events by authors who had various reasons to present the founding of Muslim rule in Jerusalem in a particular light. The specific words attributed to Omar may reflect later idealization rather than precise historical record. What the historical record does consistently show is the outcome. The Christian holy sites of Jerusalem were not destroyed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not converted to a mosque. The Christian community retained the right to worship, subject to the conditions that Islamic law applied to protected religious minorities. The Jewish community, which had been banned from Jerusalem by the Byzantines, was permitted to return to the city for the first time in centuries. That is a fact. After 6 centuries during which the city had been burned by Babylonians, its temple destroyed twice, its population deported, its very name suppressed by Roman decree, and its inhabitants subjected to multiple episodes of severe violence. The Arab conquest of Jerusalem in 637 of the Common Era was, by the standards of ancient conquest, notably restrained. That fact deserves to be stated plainly. The physical transformation of the Temple Mount under Islamic rule began within the first decades of the conquest. The platform that Herod had built, left in deliberate ruin by the Romans and apparently used as a dump during the Byzantine period, was cleared. The rock at the center of the platform, the great outcropping of natural limestone that dominated the summit, was exposed and treated with reverence. Then, in 691 of the Common Era, under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, construction was completed on a building whose beauty has not diminished in 14 centuries. The Dome of the Rock stands over the sacred rock at the center of the Temple Mount platform. It is not a mosque. This distinction matters and is frequently lost in popular accounts. A mosque is a place of congregational prayer. The Dome of the Rock was built and functions as a shrine, a structure marking and sheltering a sacred site. The octagonal form, the double ambulatory inside that allows pilgrims to circle the rock, the relationship between the building's geometry and the object it encloses, all reflect the purpose of a commemorative structure rather than a congregational one. The exterior is covered in tiles of intense blue and turquoise and white. The result of restoration work in the 16th century under the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the interior retains much more of its original Umayyad decoration. Mosaics of extraordinary refinement in gold and green and brown covering the walls and the soffits of the arches, depicting scrolling vegetation and jewels and crowns and vessels in a style that was consciously engaging with the Byzantine decorative tradition while transforming it into something specifically Islamic. The inscriptions on the drum of the dome, running in a continuous band around the interior, are among the oldest surviving examples of Quranic text in architectural form. They address, directly and pointedly, the theological claims of Christianity. They affirm that Jesus was a prophet and messenger of God, but that God has no son and is not part of a trinity. The inscriptions were not a private theological statement. They were placed in the most prominent location in the most prominent new building in Jerusalem, a city whose skyline had been dominated for 3 centuries by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. What exactly the Dome of the Rock was saying, and to whom, is a question scholars have analyzed at length. It may have been addressed primarily to the Christian community of Jerusalem. engaging with their claims about the nature of Christ. It may have been addressing the Jewish tradition's relationship to the Temple Mount. It may have been a statement of Islamic presence following the defeat of Byzantium. It may have been all of these things simultaneously. What it certainly did was change the skyline of Jerusalem in a way that has not been reversed. The Golden Dome, among the most recognizable shapes on earth, announced that the most sacred point in the city was now marked by an Islamic building. That message was not subtle. It was not designed. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, built at the southern end of the Temple Mount platform, is the congregational mosque that the Dome of the Rock is not. Together they defined the Temple Mount, known in Islamic usage as the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. As the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem under early Islamic rule was not a political capital. The Umayyad Caliphate was administered from Damascus. The Abbasid Caliphate that replaced it in 750 of the Common Era was administered from Baghdad. Jerusalem was religiously significant but politically peripheral, a distinction that mattered for how the city was resourced and administered across the centuries that followed. The city's population in this period was a mix of Arab Muslims, Arab and local Christians of various denominations, Jews who had returned after the Byzantine ban, and various other groups whose lives are documented in fragments. The religious administration of the major holy sites followed patterns established in the early period of conquest, with different communities maintaining their own sites under a framework of Islamic governance that recognized and regulated the rights of religious minorities. This did not mean the city was always peaceful. The sources for this period are incomplete and often one-sided. Episodes of tension and violence occurred alongside the longer periods of coexistence. But the framework itself was real and persistent. It would persist for 4.5 centuries, through Umayyad and Abbasid and Fatimid rule, through political upheavals and military campaigns, through earthquakes and fires and the ordinary attrition of urban life, until the year 1099 of the Common Era. That year, from the west, an army came that had not been part of the city's story before. They called themselves Crusaders, soldiers of the cross. They had been walking for 3 years to get here, and what they did when they finally entered Jerusalem would define how 3 religions remembered each other for centuries afterward. That story is next. Chapter 9. The Crusades. 3 ways to take a holy city. In the autumn of 1095 of the Common Era, Pope Urban II stood before a large crowd at Clermont in France and gave a speech he had been preparing for months. The specific words are not preserved. The accounts that survive were written years after the event by authors who were not present, and they differ from each other in ways that make reconstruction of the original impossible. What they agree on is the essential message and what followed it. Urban called on the Christian knights of Europe to take up arms, march to the Holy Land, and liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. He promised spiritual rewards for those who went. He described the suffering of Eastern Christians and connected it to the obligation of Western Christians to act. The response was beyond anything he appears to have expected. To understand why that speech produced what it produced, you have to understand the world of Western European Christianity in 1095. The concept of a holy war had been developing in Christian theology for several decades. as the Reform papacy worked to redirect the violent energies of the European knightly class toward purposes the Church could sanction. The Spanish campaigns to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule had already established a model. But Jerusalem was different from Spain. Jerusalem was where Jesus had lived and died. It was among the most sacred geography in the world for anyone who called themselves Christian. The idea that this ground was under Muslim rule, and that Christian pilgrims accessed it at the sufferance of a non-Christian power, had been generating grievance for generations. Urban speech gave that grievance a shape, a direction, and a theological sanction. Tens of thousands of people responded. The First Crusade was not a single organized army. It was a series of contingents from different regions of Western Europe, loosely coordinated through papal authorization and the personal ambitions of the noblemen who led each contingent. It was preceded by a wave of popular crusading that historians call the People's Crusade, a poorly organized movement of ordinary people that came apart disastrously before reaching the Holy Land. Along the way, that preliminary movement killed large numbers of Jewish people in the Rhine Valley in massacres that are among the earliest documented episodes of large-scale anti-Semitic violence in European history. This requires saying clearly, not as a footnote, the main crusading force reached the walls of Jerusalem in June of 1099 of the Common Era. The city was held by the Fatimid Caliphate, a dynasty based in Egypt that had taken Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks the previous year. The garrison was real. The walls were strong. The water supply outside the city was inadequate for a besieging army in summer heat. The siege lasted approximately 6 weeks. On July 15th of 1099, the Crusaders breached the wall. What followed is one of the most extensively documented episodes of mass violence in medieval history. The Crusader chroniclers who wrote about it in the immediate aftermath described the killing of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in terms they presented as triumphant. Raymond of Aguilers, a priest who was present, wrote that in the Temple of Solomon men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Historians who have studied Raymond note that he was among the more extreme voices among the Crusader chroniclers, and that the specific image he used derives from a passage in the Book of Revelation, making it uncertain whether he was providing a literal description or reaching for scriptural language to interpret what he had seen. Both may have been true simultaneously. His account deserves to be read with awareness of its immediacy and its rhetorical purpose. What the evidence does consistently indicate is that the killing was extensive and indiscriminate. The Muslim population of the city was killed in large numbers. The Jewish community, which had reportedly taken refuge in a synagogue, was killed or expelled. The scale was large enough that some contemporary observers, including some within the Crusader movement itself, expressed unease. Sit with that. Not as a verdict on an entire civilization, not as something to be explained away by comparison with other medieval violence, as what it was, a city that had been home to Muslims and Jews for more than 4 centuries was taken, and a large proportion of its non-Christian inhabitants were killed over the course of a few days. That happened. It was recorded by the people who did it. And it was remembered. It is still remembered. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem that emerged governed the city and the surrounding territory for roughly 88 years, until 1187 of the Common Era. It was a genuinely strange political entity, a French-speaking feudal kingdom transplanted into the eastern Mediterranean, sustained by a continuous flow of crusaders and pilgrims from Western Europe and by the military orders. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, that became its most effective fighting force. Jerusalem, under Crusader rule, was a Christian city. The Dome of the Rock was converted into a church. The Al-Aqsa Mosque became the headquarters of the Knights Templar. The city's Muslim and Jewish populations had been killed, expelled, or enslaved at the conquest and were not permitted to return. The kingdom was also, from its earliest years, militarily precarious. It held the coast and the key towns of the interior, but was surrounded by Muslim powers that were larger, more populous, and had every motivation to reclaim the territory. It survived as long as it did through military skill, exploitation of divisions among its Muslim neighbors, and the continued flow of men and resources from Europe. The man who ended it is remembered very differently by different traditions. Saladin, whose full name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was a Kurdish military commander who had risen to become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. His career was built on genuine military ability, political skill of a high order, and a self-conscious commitment to the concept of jihad that he used both as personal motivation and as a political tool to unite the fractious Muslim powers of the region behind his leadership. He met the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin on July 4th of 1187. The Crusaders found themselves in a waterless environment in summer heat. Their supply lines cut. Their army unable to reach water before exhaustion overtook them. They were destroyed almost completely. The King of Jerusalem was captured. The true cross, carried into battle as the most sacred talisman in Christendom, was taken. Jerusalem itself, with its garrison devastated, was effectively defenseless. Saladin's entry into Jerusalem on October 2nd of 1187 was as different from the Crusader entry of 1099 as two military conquests of the same city could possibly be. There was no massacre. The Christian population was given the option to ransom their freedom. Those who could pay were permitted to leave with their possessions. Saladin reportedly paid the ransom for a number of poor Christians from his own treasury. Contemporary sources, including Christian ones, describe his conduct as honorable. The reasons for this conduct are not simple, and reducing them to a single explanation would misrepresent a complex man acting in a complex situation. Saladin was genuinely devout by the accounts of those around him. The liberation of Jerusalem after nearly 90 years of Crusader control was for him a deeply religious achievement. The behavior consistent with Islamic teaching about the treatment of conquered peoples also carried strategic value. A conqueror known for clemency is easier to deal with diplomatically than a conqueror known for massacre. The Dome of the Rock was restored to its function as an Islamic shrine. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. The Christian community retained the right to visit and maintain their holy sites, subject to payment of a fee. The Third Crusade, launched in response to the fall of Jerusalem, brought the most famous crusader of all, Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart, led a campaign of considerable military effectiveness that retook the coastal cities but failed to retake Jerusalem. He and Saladin negotiated a treaty in 1192, granting Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites without restoring Christian political control of the city. The two men never met in person. The correspondence between them, preserved in Arabic sources, shows something stranger and more interesting than simple enmity. A mutual respect, perhaps even genuine admiration, between military commanders who recognized each other's quality across a divide of religion and culture that both of them took entirely seriously. And then comes the episode that most people do not know. The one that is, in some ways, the most revealing of all three. In 1229 of the Common Era, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II negotiated a treaty with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, that returned Jerusalem to Christian control without a single battle being fought. Frederick was, by the standards of his time, a genuinely unusual figure. He spoke 6 languages. He had grown up in Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures had coexisted in unusual proximity. He maintained Muslim scholars at his court. He was also, at the time of the negotiations, under excommunication by Pope Gregory IX, which meant that technically the most powerful Christian monarch in Europe was conducting diplomacy on behalf of Christendom while formally excluded from the Church. The treaty gave Christians control of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth for 10 years. While the Temple Mount remained under Muslim administration and Muslim residents retained their rights, both sides hated it. The Pope refused to recognize a treaty negotiated by an excommunicated emperor. Christian hardliners were furious that the Temple Mount was not included. Muslim scholars condemned al-Kamil for surrendering Jerusalem without a fight, calling it a betrayal. When Frederick entered Jerusalem and placed a crown on his own head in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there was no one willing to perform the ceremony. He did it himself, alone, in an empty church, with no clergy present and no crowd to witness it. 3 ways to take a holy city. The massacre of 1099, the clemency of 1187, the negotiated return of 1229. Each said something different about the relationship between faith and power, between religious conviction and practical calculation, between what people believe they are fighting for and what they are actually doing when they fight. None of them resolved the question of Jerusalem. Chapter 10. Mamluks, Ottomans, and the city Suleiman built. Jerusalem fell permanently out of Crusader reach in 1244 of the Common Era, passing within a few years under Mamluk control. The Mamluks were one of the stranger governing classes in medieval history. Their name means owned. It was literally accurate. They were a military caste recruited from Turkish and Circassian slave populations, trained from childhood as soldiers, converted to Islam as part of their formation. The paradox was that these enslaved soldiers eventually became the rulers of Egypt and Syria, overthrowing the dynasties that had owned them. The system produced an extraordinarily effective fighting force at its best, an administration of genuine capability. Their first great achievement for this region was stopping the Mongols. The Mongol conquests of the mid-13th century had destroyed Baghdad, ended the Abbasid Caliphate, and devastated the Islamic heartland in ways from which large parts of it did not recover for generations. The Mamluk victory at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 of the Common Era, in the Jezreel Valley, not far from Jerusalem, stopped the Mongol advance into the Levant. Jerusalem was spared the fate of Baghdad Walk the streets of the Muslim quarter, approaching the Haram al-Sharif today, and you are walking through one of the finest surviving ensembles of medieval Islamic urban architecture anywhere in the world. The madrasas and the ribats. Religious schools and pilgrim hostels with their carved stone facades of alternating cream and red and black. Their elaborate muqarnas portals, their calligraphic inscriptions, represent sustained investment across more than 2 centuries of Mamluk rule. This is the city that Mamluk patronage built, and much of it is still standing. Here is a detail from this period that most people overlook, but that captures something true about how Jerusalem actually functioned across these centuries. The keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were held by a Muslim family, not because of any dramatic negotiation or political arrangement, but because the different Christian denominations could not agree among themselves which of them should hold the keys. A neutral party was needed. A Muslim family had provided that service since the early Islamic period, and they continued to provide it under the Mamluks just as they had before and would continue to after. The Jude family, who hold the keys today, have been in this role for centuries. The doorkeeper function has been performed by the Nusaybe family across a similarly long span. Ordinary life finding its own solutions to impossible theological disagreements. That is Jerusalem in miniature. The pilgrimage economy continued under Mamluk rule. Muslim pilgrims came from across the Islamic world to pray at the Haram al-Sharif. Jewish pilgrims maintained their presence at the Western Wall. Christian pilgrims accessed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre under arrangements that generally preserved the ability of all 3 communities to maintain contact with their sacred places. Then the Ottoman Empire arrived. The Ottoman Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluk army in 1516 of the Common Era. The Mamluk Empire collapsed within months. Jerusalem passed to Ottoman rule without significant resistance. The Sultan who would define the Ottoman relationship with Jerusalem was Suleiman I. He ruled from 1520 to 1566 of the Common Era, a reign of 46 years that represented the peak of Ottoman power and cultural achievement. The Islamic world calls him Suleiman the Magnificent for his legal reforms. What Suleiman did for Jerusalem was more lasting than anything any single ruler had done for the city since Herod the Great. He rebuilt the walls that enclose the old city of Jerusalem today, that millions of visitors walk on and that appear in almost every photograph of the city, are Suleiman's walls. Construction began in 1537 and was completed in 1541 of the Common Era. A continuous circuit of pale limestone approximately 4 kilometers around, punctuated by 34 towers and 7 gates. Constructed from the same stone as the buildings within, so that the whole complex seems to grow from the ground rather than sit on top of it. Put your hands on those stones if you ever visit. They have been there for nearly 500 years. They absorbed every morning and evening in that half-millennium. They were there when the British walked through the Jaffa Gate in 1917. They were there during the fighting of 1948. They are there now. Suleiman also restored the decoration of the Dome of the Rock, replacing the exterior mosaics with the glazed tiles in blue and turquoise and white that define its appearance today. He restored the water supply system. He established charitable foundations including a soup kitchen that fed hundreds of people daily. The Ottoman period in Jerusalem lasted from 1517 to 1917 of the Common Era. 400 years exactly. the longest continuous period of rule under a single political authority that the city has ever experienced. The 4 centuries were not uniformly prosperous. The 17th and 18th centuries brought periods of relative neglect as the empire's attention and resources were consumed by wars on multiple fronts. Jerusalem's population fluctuated. The 19th century brought new pressures that would prove more consequential than anything the Ottomans could manage. European powers had developed systems of treaty relationships, giving their nationals special privileges in Ottoman territories. France held the position of protector of Catholic holy sites and pilgrims in Jerusalem. Russia claimed a similar role for Orthodox Christianity. The competition between French and Russian claims over specific sites in Jerusalem was a significant factor in the chain of events leading to the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. Religious disputes over a few square meters of stone in the old city contributing to a war that killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers across 3 years. That is how much this city can make otherwise rational people do. The 19th century also brought European Jewish immigration to Palestine in significant numbers for the first time in centuries. The pogroms that swept through Jewish communities of the Russian Empire from the 1880s onward, organized violence carrying the implicit or explicit sanction of Tsarist authorities, generated a movement of people whose scale made staying an increasingly untenable choice for those who could find a way to leave. Some went to Western Europe, some went to the United States, some went to Palestine, driven by the connection between the land and the core of Jewish religious and cultural identity maintained across 2 millennia. The movement that gave this immigration its most explicit political form was Zionism. Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist whose experience of anti-Semitism convinced him that the integration of Jews into European society was neither possible nor safe, published his foundational text in 1896, arguing for the establishment of a Jewish state. The religious and historical logic that gave the movement its deepest energy pointed toward Palestine, the land that Jewish tradition called home, the land from which the exile had begun. By 1914, when the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, Jerusalem had a population of roughly 60 to 70,000 people, divided approximately equally among Muslims, Yevus, and Christians. It was about to enter something entirely different. The British general Edmund Allenby accepted the surrender of Jerusalem on December 9th of 1917 of the Common Era. 2 days later, he entered the city. On foot, the decision not to ride was deliberate. The contrast with Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had ridden into Jerusalem on a white horse during an official visit in 1898 through a breach specially made in the wall beside the Jaffa Gate, so his procession would not have to dismount, was almost certainly intentional. In a city where every gesture carries symbolic weight, Allenby walked. He read a proclamation in 7 languages announcing that the holy places of all 3 religions would be protected and that existing laws and customs would be respected. What it could not say was what came next, because the answer to that question had already been given, in overlapping and contradictory forms. In documents produced in London in the preceding 2 years. Chapter 11. The British Mandate and the Impossible Promise. There is a woman named Fatima, who was born in Jerusalem in 1910 and died in a refugee camp in Lebanon in 1978. She was 7 years old when Allenby walked through the Jaffa Gate. She was 11 when the British Mandate was formally established. She was 23 when the Arab Revolt began. She was 38 when the British announced they were leaving. She was 38 and 5 months when the State of Israel was declared. She was 38 and 6 months when she walked out of her neighborhood in Jerusalem carrying her youngest child and a bundle of her family's belongings, expecting to come back in a few weeks when the fighting had settled. She did not come back. Neither did her children. Neither did her grandchildren, who were still in that camp when she died. She is not one specific person. She is a composite who stands for the hundreds of thousands of women whose lives followed that arc, documented in oral histories and refugee records and the testimony of family members who survived long enough to tell the story. She is here because this chapter cannot be told honestly without her being in it. In the summer and autumn of 1915, of the Common Era, a British official in Cairo named Henry McMahon conducted a correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the guardian of the holy cities of Islam and the most prestigious Arab leader in the region. Hussein wanted British support for an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Britain wanted the revolt because it would tie down Ottoman forces on multiple fronts. The letters that passed between them over several months are known as the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, and they are among the most carefully analyzed documents in modern Middle Eastern history. Hussein understood from the correspondence that Britain was promising to support the establishment of an independent Arab state, or states, in the territories liberated from Ottoman rule, including, in the Arab understanding, Palestine. Britain's position, then and in subsequent decades, was that the correspondence did not promise Palestine specifically, that the language was ambiguous, that various qualifications applied. The Arab understanding was that it did. This disagreement is not a minor technical dispute. It is the foundational disagreement about the legitimacy of what followed in Palestine, and it has never been resolved. Less than 2 years later, a second document added another layer. On November 2nd of 1917, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour sent a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a prominent leader of the British Jewish community, for transmission to the Zionist Federation. The letter stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and would use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, with the clear understanding that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration became one of the most consequential pieces of paper in modern history. It was also, as critics noted from the day it was issued, internally contradictory. It promised to facilitate a Jewish national home while protecting the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. By most available estimates at the time, those communities constituted the large majority of Palestine's population, roughly 90% Arab and 10% Jewish, by some demographic assessments of the period, though historians note that such figures carry uncertainty. Whether both commitments could be honoured simultaneously was a question the document did not address. Why did Britain issue this declaration? Historians have debated the motivations for a century. The factors most widely cited include genuine sympathy for Zionist aspirations among some British officials, including Balfour himself, who had a background in Christian Zionism, strategic calculations about securing Jewish support in the United States and Russia for the war effort, The desire to establish a British presence in Palestine that would balance French ambitions in the region after the war. What is clear is that Britain was making a promise about a territory it did not yet control, to a population that was a minority in that territory, while having made commitments of a different kind to the Arab leadership whose revolt was still ongoing. The inconsistency was not accidental. It was the product of a war in which different commitments were made to different parties because the immediate priority was winning, and the question of how to reconcile those commitments was left for afterward. Afterward arrived in the form of the British Mandate for Palestine, formalized by the League of Nations in 1922. Which gave Britain administrative responsibility for the territory and explicitly incorporated the Balfour Declaration into its founding document. The Mandate period was, from beginning to end, a story of irreconcilable promises meeting each other in a specific place, with real people caught in the consequences. People like Fatima, and people like the young men arriving by ship from the displaced persons camps of post-Holocaust Europe, carrying everything they had left in a single bag, looking at the shore of a land their prayers had been directed toward for 2,000 years. Both sets of people were real. Both sets of claims were real. The tragedy of the Mandate period is not that one side was wrong and the other was right. The tragedy is that two genuine claims, each rooted in genuine history and genuine suffering, arrived at the same place at the same time and found no room. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased substantially through the 1920s and 30s. Driven by the continued persecution of Jewish communities in Europe and accelerated dramatically by the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany after 1933. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime between 1941 and 1945, transformed the context of everything. The survivors of the camps, along with millions of additional displaced Jews across Europe who could not return to communities destroyed by war and persecution, faced a world that largely did not want them. For many of them, and for much of the world observing their situation, the most compelling answer was Palestine. The Arab population of Palestine experienced the increasing immigration as an existential threat to their future in their own land. Violence between communities was intermittent through the 1920s and became more sustained through the 30s. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 required significant British military resources to suppress. In February of 1947, the British government announced it was handing the Palestine question to the newly formed United Nations and withdrawing from the mandate. It was giving up. The United Nations proposed a partition plan in 1947, dividing Palestine into a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an international zone covering Jerusalem and Bethlehem, because the committee recognized that no single nation's sovereignty over Jerusalem could be accepted by the other side. The General Assembly approved the plan in Resolution 181 on November 29th of 1947. The Jewish Agency accepted the plan. The Arab states and the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected it, arguing the United Nations had no authority to partition a territory against the wishes of its majority population. The British Mandate expired at midnight on May 14th of 1948. Hours before it expired, David Ben-Gurion read a Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv, establishing the State of Israel. The following morning, the armies of 5 Arab states crossed into Palestine. What followed is remembered in two ways that are genuinely incompatible, and both reflect real historical experience. In the Israeli memory and in the understanding of Jewish communities worldwide, May 14th of 1948 is Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, the fulfillment of a 2,000-year longing, the establishment of a state for a people who had survived everything history could throw at them. In the Palestinian Arab memory, and in the understanding of Arab communities across the region, the same events constitute the Nakba, the catastrophe. During the war that followed, estimates by historians suggest somewhere between 700,000 and 900,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes. Villages were destroyed. Communities that had existed for generations ceased to exist. The people who left became refugees, and their descendants remain refugees today in camps in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The establishment of Israel was an act of national liberation and the fulfillment of a genuine historical longing. The creation of the refugee crisis was a human catastrophe of real and lasting dimensions. These are not statements that cancel each other out. They are both accurate descriptions of what happened, from the different perspectives of the people to whom it happened. Fatima walked out of her neighborhood carrying her youngest child. She expected to come back. She never did. Chapter 12. War, Partition, and the Divided City. The war that followed Israel's declaration of independence is remembered differently depending on who is telling the story. And that difference begins with the name. Israelis call it the War of Independence. Palestinian Arabs and Arab states call it the Nakba War, or the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The different names are not a semantic dispute. They describe genuinely different experiences of the same events. The military outcome was an Israeli victory. By the time armistice agreements were signed through 1949, Israel controlled more territory than the UN partition plan had allocated to the Jewish state. Jordan held the West Bank and the eastern part of Jerusalem, including the entire Old City. Egypt held the Gaza Strip. The Palestinians had no state. The armistice line that divided Jerusalem was not an internationally recognized border. It was a line where the fighting had stopped. A physical boundary of barbed wire and concrete ran through the city, dividing neighborhoods that had been continuous, cutting streets that had connected people to their daily lives. The Mandelbaum Gate, a small crossing point on this line, was, for 19 years, the only authorized passage between the two halves of the city. Ordinary residents of either side could not simply walk to the other. A city that had been a single physical space for most of the previous 3,000 years was cut in two by barbed wire. The Jewish quarter of the Old City, which had housed a continuous Jewish community for centuries, had fallen to Jordanian forces during the May fighting. Its synagogues were damaged or destroyed. The Western Wall was inaccessible to Jewish worshippers. The cemetery on the Mount of Olives, one of the oldest and most sacred Jewish cemeteries in the world, was damaged, and many of its tombstones were reportedly used as paving material during the Jordanian period. These facts are part of the documented historical record. Jordan's annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem in 1950 was recognized formally by only two countries, Britain and Pakistan. Most of the international community did not recognize Jordanian sovereignty over East Jerusalem, establishing the legal position maintained by most countries to the present day. The final status of Jerusalem had not been resolved by the events of 1948 and 1949. That legal position would become very important in 1967. The Six-Day War of June 1967 was one of the fastest military transformations in modern history. Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egyptian forces on June 5th. Following escalating tension in which Egypt had closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping and massed forces on the border, Jordan, which had a mutual defense treaty with Egypt, entered the war on June 5th after receiving inaccurate information about the state of the battle. Israeli forces fought through the West Bank over 3 days. On June 7th of 1967, Israeli paratroopers reached the Western Wall. The radio broadcast of their commander, Mordecai Gur, saying that the Temple Mount is in our hands, is among the most widely known moments in Israeli history. The soldiers at the wall were photographed with tears on their faces. The emotional reality of that moment needs to be understood rather than passed over. For 2,000 years, in every daily Jewish prayer service, the community had prayed toward Jerusalem and toward the site of the temple. For 19 years, the Western Wall had been inaccessible. The people who stood there on June 7th of 1967 were not simply soldiers completing a military objective. In their own understanding, and in the understanding of Jewish communities worldwide, they were experiencing the fulfillment of something their tradition had maintained alive across an almost incomprehensible length of time. That emotional reality coexisted with a different reality that was equally true. The Israeli military victory of 1967 brought under Israeli control the entire West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. These territories contained large numbers of Palestinians who had not chosen to live under Israeli rule and had no vote in the Israeli government that now controlled their lives. Israel annexed East Jerusalem and the surrounding area immediately after the war. The United Nations Security Council rejected this in Resolution 252 of 1968, calling on Israel to rescind the annexation measures. Israel did not do so. The status of Jerusalem after 1967 is precisely where the terminology becomes most contested, and where careful language is most important. Israel describes East Jerusalem as part of its sovereign capital, reunified after 19 years of division, and has governed it as such for nearly 6 decades. Palestinians describe East Jerusalem as Palestinian territory under Israeli control, the intended capital of a future Palestinian state, and regard the annexation as inconsistent with international law. Most countries in the world, and most international legal authorities, regard the status of Jerusalem as unresolved and subject to negotiation, declining to recognize either Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem or any other unilateral determination of the city's future. Almost every country maintains its embassy in Tel Aviv rather than Jerusalem as a reflection of this position. The United States departed from this in 2017 when it moved its embassy to Jerusalem, a decision most other governments did not follow. These positions have different relationships to the relevant UN resolutions and different degrees of recognition by the international community. This account presents them as they are, without endorsing any of them. What happened on the ground in Jerusalem after 1967 was a set of physical changes visible in the city today. The buildings of the Moroccan quarter adjacent to the Western Wall, a neighborhood housing a Muslim community for centuries, were demolished within days of the Israeli conquest to create the open plaza that now stands before the wall. The demolition occurred in the middle of the night. Residents were given very little notice. This is documented historical record. Israeli residential neighborhoods were subsequently built in areas of East Jerusalem that Israel had annexed, in locations that the Israeli government describes as parts of its capital and that most international bodies characterize differently. The specific language used for these communities is one of the most contested questions in the language of the conflict. This account applies the same principle it has applied throughout. It presents the positions of the parties without adopting any single characterization as definitive. Jerusalem after 1967 was in practice a single city administered by a single government. It was in the understanding of most of the world a city whose final status remained unresolved. Both of those things were simultaneously true. Chapter 13. The Question That Has No Agreed Answer. In July of 2000 of the Common Era, President Bill Clinton brought together the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and the Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat at Camp David in Maryland for a summit both sides and their American hosts hoped would finally resolve Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The talks lasted 14 days. They came closer to a comprehensive agreement than any previous negotiation. And they failed. The reasons for the failure have been analyzed and disputed for more than 2 decades. The participants themselves disagree about what happened, who offered what, and who bears primary responsibility for the breakdown. What the available evidence does indicate is that the gap between the minimum positions of the parties was wide, particularly on Jerusalem, and that neither side was able to move far enough to bridge it within the time frame of the summit. Jerusalem was the issue where the gap was widest. The Israeli position accepted Palestinian administrative control over some Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem and proposed some form of Palestinian functional control over the Muslim and Christian holy sites on the Temple Mount. The exact formulation has been described differently by different participants. The Palestinian position was that East Jerusalem, including the entirety of the Haram al-Sharif, must be under Palestinian sovereignty as the capital of a Palestinian state. The gap between these positions was not primarily about practical arrangements. It was about sovereignty, and sovereignty over Jerusalem is not, for either side, a practical question. It is an identity question. The Israeli position that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel is not simply a negotiating stance. It reflects a genuine understanding of what Jerusalem means to the Jewish people and to the State of Israel. Rooted in 2,000 years of prayer and longing and the particular intensity of a people who have been expelled from this city and who have never stopped believing they would return, the Palestinian position that East Jerusalem is Palestinian territory and the intended capital of a Palestinian state is equally not simply a negotiating stance. It reflects the genuine understanding of a people who have lived in this city and its surroundings for generations, whose religious connection to the Islamic holy sites on the Temple Mount is deep and real, and who regard the annexation as an ongoing injustice. When two identity claims of this kind are in direct conflict over the same territory, the tools of ordinary diplomacy are often not sufficient. You cannot split the difference on a place that both sides regard as the center of what they are. The Temple Mount is where this becomes most acute. The Islamic Waqf, the religious endowment authority, administers the site, and manages its mosques and daily operations, Israeli police control access from the outside, managing who enters, through which gate, and at which hours. Non-Muslim visitors are permitted during specified hours through designated entry points. Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount is officially prohibited under Israeli government policy. Though this policy has been contested and tested repeatedly by religious groups who argue that Jews have the right to pray on the most sacred ground in Judaism, every significant event in the broader conflict produces tremors here. Changes in Israeli policy regarding access, incidents of violence within or near the compound, construction work that any party interprets as altering the physical reality of the site. All of these can produce diplomatic crises and public protests within days. The Temple Mount is not just the most sacred place in Jerusalem. It is the most volatile, the place where the sacred and the political are most completely fused and most completely unable to be separated. Subsequent negotiations after Camp David continued intermittently without producing a comprehensive agreement. The Second Intifada, the period of intense Israeli-Palestinian violence from 2000 to approximately 2005, killed several thousand people on both sides and produced a level of mutual distrust that made subsequent negotiations significantly harder. In July of 2024, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the Israeli presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. The court's opinion, which is advisory rather than legally binding, but which carries significant weight as the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, concluded that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, is inconsistent with international law. The court found that Israel has an obligation to end that presence, and that all states have an obligation not to recognize the situation and not to provide assistance in maintaining it. Israel rejected the court's advisory opinion, stating it was based on a distorted, factual, and legal basis, and failed to account for Israel's fundamental rights of self-defense and the historical and religious connections of the Jewish people to the land. The United States expressed reservations about aspects of the opinion. The majority of United Nations General Assembly member states have consistently supported resolutions affirming Palestinian rights and calling for a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Positions broadly consistent with what the advisory opinion addressed. The advisory opinion did not change the situation on the ground. It did not remove a single settlement or alter the administration of a single neighborhood. What it did was add another authoritative legal voice to a position the international community has held, in various forms, for nearly 6 decades. The conflict that most recently produced a severe crisis in and around this region began on October 7th of 2023, when Hamas, the militant organization controlling the Gaza Strip, launched an attack on communities in southern Israel. The attack resulted in approximately 1,200 people killed and the taking of hostages. These are the figures most widely reported and cited across news organizations covering the event. The Israeli military response in Gaza has produced, by the accounts of multiple humanitarian organizations and international bodies, severe civilian casualties and a humanitarian crisis. Both the scale of those casualties and the legal and moral characterization of the response are the subject of intense international dispute that is ongoing as of the time of this account. This account presents that disagreement as it exists, without resolving it. Jerusalem was not the site of the main military events, but Jerusalem is always at the center of what the surrounding conflict is about. The question of sovereignty over this city, the question of the Temple Mount, the question of Palestinian statehood with Jerusalem as its capital, all of these were present in the conflict that began in October 2023, as they have been present in every conflict involving this city for the previous 3,000 years. The honest position, the only position the historical record supports, is that none of these questions has been answered. The people who have proposed to answer them by force have consistently found that force can change who controls a city, but cannot change what it means to the people who regard it as sacred. The people who have tried to answer them through negotiation have consistently found that the gap between the minimum positions of the parties on Jerusalem specifically is very difficult to bridge. This is where the question stands in 2026. Some questions are not resolved. They are lived with. Chapter 14. The Old City in the Morning. There is an hour in Jerusalem that visitors tend to remember long after they have forgotten everything else about the visit. Early morning, before the tourist crowds arrive, before the heat builds. The Old City is quiet in a way it almost never is at any other hour. The pale limestone catches the early light and holds it differently from how ordinary stone holds light. It glows slightly, not as a metaphor, literally. There is a quality to Jerusalem stone in early morning light that people attempt to describe and consistently fail to capture adequately. In that hour, if you walk from the Jaffa Gate toward the heart of the Old City, you pass through a space less than 1 square kilometer in total area that contains, for 3 of the world's great religions, almost no comparable equivalent anywhere on earth. The Western Wall is alive with prayer at this hour. It is always alive with prayer. The plaza operates essentially around the clock. Worshippers present at every hour of the day and night. Some stand and rock gently in the ancient rhythm of Jewish prayer. Some sit and read. Some press their foreheads against the warm stone in an act of physical contact with something they regard as the most sacred ground their faith can offer. A short walk away, up the ramp that leads to the Haram al-Sharif. The morning light strikes the gold of the dome of the rock at an angle that makes the building look, at that specific hour, as though it does not entirely belong to the material world. The gold, the blue, the proportions of the drum and the dome, the way it sits at the center of the open platform with the surrounding city's rooflines visible beyond it, produce an effect that exceeds what the sum of its architectural elements should produce. No photograph fully conveys what it looks like in person. A few minutes further by foot, in the Christian Quarter, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is preparing for morning services. The church is shared among 6 Christian denominations: the Greek Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, the Armenian Apostolic, the Coptic, the Ethiopian, and the Syriac Orthodox, under an arrangement known as the status quo. The rights of each community to specific spaces within the church and the timing of their respective liturgies are fixed by precedent going back to the Ottoman period, and any change requires the agreement of all parties, which in practice means changes almost never happen. The key to the main door is held by the Jude family, a Muslim family who have been custodians of that key since the Saladin period. The doorkeeper function is performed by the Nusayba family, another Muslim family who have held this role since at least the 17th century. This is not a curiosity. It is a working model of how communities with competing claims to the same sacred space can coexist through very specific agreements about who controls what. When and how, it is imperfect. It has produced genuine conflicts over the placement of a ladder on a roof, the repair of a doorstep. The arrangement has survived centuries of political change around it. The old city is divided into 4 quarters. The Muslim quarter, covering roughly half the area and the most densely populated. Its streets around the Damascus Gate among the most commercially active in the city. The Jewish quarter, rebuilt after 1967, quieter and more recently restored. The Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, the smallest. Its community ancient in Jerusalem with connections going back to the early Christian period. It is easy to miss, when looking at the old city from the outside, from the news and the weight of its historical significance, that it is a functioning neighborhood, not just a museum, not just a collection of sacred sites, both of those things, yes, but also a place where children go to school, where people buy groceries, where neighbors argue about parking, where shopkeepers open and close their shutters with the kind of routine that only makes sense if you are planning to be here tomorrow. There is a man who has been selling coffee from a small cart near the entrance to the Damascus Gate every morning for more than 20 years. His name does not appear in any history of this city. He stands for the thousands of ordinary people whose daily rhythms have always made this place function. In every century, and under every flag, people whose names history never bothered to keep, but without whom the city would simply stop. He has watched politicians arrive for summits that failed, and tourists arrive for experiences they cannot describe, and worshippers arrive for the thing they come here for every morning without fail. He is in no historical record, but he is Jerusalem too. The management of the Temple Mount operates under arrangements in constant tension. The Islamic Waqf administers the site and manages its mosques and daily operations. Israeli police control access from the outside. Non-Muslim visitors are permitted during specified hours. Jewish prayer on the site is officially prohibited under Israeli government policy, a policy contested by religious groups who regard it as an unjustifiable restriction. There is a weight to this city that visitors feel even when they cannot name it. The compressed significance of what has happened here, not just in the major historical events, but in the daily accumulation of prayer and argument and coffee and commerce and mourning and celebration across 5,000 years, has settled into the stone in a way that older visitors sometimes describe as almost physical, something that presses gently but constantly. You cannot be neutral in Jerusalem. The city will not allow it. But you can be attentive. You can listen to more than one story at the same time. You can let the complexity remain complex rather than resolving it prematurely into something more comfortable. That, at least, is what this account has tried to do. Chapter 15. The city that belongs to everyone and no one. Let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning of history. Though we have traveled a very long way through history in this account, the beginning of the question this story has been asking from its first words. What makes a city worth this much? We said at the start that Jerusalem should not matter this much. no great river, no natural harbour, thin soil on a highland ridge. By every practical measure of what makes a city important, it has almost nothing that the cities of the ancient world competed for. Carthage had a harbour. Babylon had the Euphrates. Alexandria had the Mediterranean and the trade routes of 2 continents. Jerusalem had a spring and a story, and the particular capacity of a specific kind of story to generate more meaning with every retelling than it had the time before. The spring is still there. The Gihon Spring still flows beneath the City of David Archaeological Park. You can visit it. You can stand in the darkness of the rock-cut tunnel that Hezekiah's engineers cut through solid limestone. A tunnel in use since the 8th century before the Common Era, and feel the water moving past your feet, cold and indifferent to everything that has happened above it. That water was flowing when the Jebusites built their first walls on the ridge above. It was flowing when David's soldiers climbed through the shaft. It was flowing when Solomon's builders raised the temple. It was flowing when the Babylonians burned everything down. It was flowing when the exiles walked back from Babylon and started again. It was flowing through the Roman period, the Byzantine period, the Islamic period, the Crusader period, the Ottoman period, the British Mandate, and through every war and failed negotiation and act of extraordinary generosity this city has witnessed across 5,000 years. The water does not care about any of it. The water just flows. But the people who came to this spring, and the people who descended from those people, and the people who absorbed the stories those people told about this place, did care. They cared in ways that multiplied rather than diminished across time. That survived every catastrophe and dispersal history could produce. That proved resistant to every attempt to extinguish or redirect them. Why this city and not another? Why this particular ridge in this particular part of the world? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. We can describe the process. We can trace how Jerusalem accumulated its layers of significance, how each tradition built on and transformed what came before, how loss intensified meaning, how exile made the absent city more precious than the present city had been, how conquest and displacement and rebuilding repeated the cycle across generation after generation. But the specific why of it resists a fully satisfying answer that does not resort to the theological language of the traditions that regard the city as sacred. The most honest position is simply to accept the city as what it is, a place that became, through a combination of geography and accident and human decision and religious conviction and the compounding of meaning across time, among the most significant and contested cities in the history of the world. What we can say, after 5,000 years of evidence, is what this city does to the people who encounter it. It makes them take sides. It is nearly impossible to spend time in Jerusalem and remain neutral. The quality of the light on the stone, the proximity of claims that are each from inside the tradition that makes them, both sincere and total, has a way of pressing itself on the consciousness in a way that most cities do not. Jerusalem asks you to decide who is right, who belongs, who has the better claim. Those are the wrong questions. Or rather, they are questions whose honest answers are more complicated than the asking of them suggests. The claims of the Jewish people to this city are real and ancient, grounded in 2,000 years of prayer and longing and the specific historical experience of a people who were expelled from this place and never stopped facing in its direction. The claims of the Palestinian people to this city are real and contemporary, grounded in generations of living here, building here, worshipping here, and being displaced from here in ways that are documented and ongoing. The claims of the Christian world to the sites in this city where the foundational events of their faith took place are real and immense, connected to a tradition shaping the moral and spiritual vocabulary of more than 2 billion people. The claims of the Islamic world to the third holiest site in their religion are real and centuries old, connected to a faith shaping the lives of nearly 2 billion more. None of these claims cancel each other out. They all exist simultaneously. In a city approximately 1 square kilometer at its ancient core, the people who live in Jerusalem know something about this that people who observe it from the outside sometimes miss: daily life in this city. The getting of groceries and the raising of children and the arguing with neighbors and the walking to work goes on despite the weight of what the city carries. People are not, most of them, most of the time, consumed by the historical significance of where they live. The weight exists in the background like a low-frequency sound that you stop consciously hearing after a while, but that is always there. It is present in the question of which language the road sign is in. It is present in the checkpoints that some residents pass through and others do not. It is present every morning in the call to prayer and the church bells and the sound of prayer at the Western Wall, all of them rising from the same hill within minutes of each other, none of them waiting for the others to finish. There are people who believe the question of Jerusalem will be answered in their lifetime. There are people who have stopped believing that. There are people who pray for an answer every morning. This account does not know which of them is right. History suggests that resolved questions do not look the way this question looks after 5,000 years of human effort directed at it. But history also contains surprises. Moments when what looked permanently impossible became simply fact in a relatively short time. The exile ended. The walls Hadrian built did not erase Jerusalem. The destruction of the temple did not end Jewish connection to this place. The Crusader kingdom lasted less than a century. The arrangements of today are not necessarily the arrangements of tomorrow. What is permanent is the spring. What is permanent is the rock at the center of the platform. What is permanent is the limestone that catches the morning light and holds it in a way that people have been trying to describe for 5,000 years and have consistently found that ordinary language is not quite enough. Right now, somewhere in Jerusalem, the Fajr prayer is being called from a minaret before dawn. Somewhere in Jerusalem, Jewish worshippers are at the Western Wall before the sun rises. Their prayers addressed toward the temple that has been gone for 2,000 years and that they have never stopped believing will return. Somewhere in Jerusalem, a Christian pilgrim is standing in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on their first visit, trying to understand what they are feeling, and finding that the word they are looking for has not quite been invented yet. And in a tunnel beneath the city of David, in the channel that Hezekiah's engineers completed, a tunnel in use since the 8th century before the Common Era, water is moving through the darkness from the Gihon spring toward the ancient pool. The spring keeps flowing. We will see you in the past.